as there is no dominant national language. The four main languages of French, Italian, German and Romansch form the four branches which make up a literature of Switzerland. The original Swiss Confederation, from its foundation in 1291 up to 1798, gained only a few French-speaking districts in what is now the Canton of Fribourg, and so the German language dominated. During that period the Swiss vernacular literature was in German, although in the 18th century, French became fashionable in Bern and elsewhere. At that time, Geneva and Lausanne were not yet Swiss. Geneva was an ally and Vaud a subject land. The French branch does not really begin to qualify as Swiss writing until after 1815, when the French-speaking regions gained full status as Swiss cantons. The Italian and Romansch-laden branches are less prominent. Like the earlier Charters of Liberties, the original League of 1291 was drawn up in Latin. Later alliances among the cantons, as well as documents concerning the whole Confederation, the Parsons Ordinance of 1370, the Sempach Ordinance of 1393, the Compact of Stans and all the recesses of the Diets, were compiled in German. Political documents are not necessarily literature, but these pre-Reformation alliances rested on popular consent, and were expressed in vernacular German rather than in clerkly Latin. German branch. Emergence of vernacular literature. First in order of date of the Minnesingers, the number of whom in the districts that ultimately formed part of the medieval Swiss Confederation are said to have exceeded 30. Zurich then was the chief literary center of the Confederation. The two Mannesses collected many of the songs in a manuscript that has happily come down to us and is preserved in Paris. The most prominent was Master John Hadlab, who flourished in the second half of the 13th and the first quarter of the 14th centuries. Next we have a long series of war songs, celebrating the victories of the Swiss. One of the earliest and most famous of these was composed by Hans Halbsuter of Lucerne to commemorate the Battle of Sempach, not far from his native town. There are other similar songs for the victory of Naples and those of the Battle of Grandson and Battle of Morat in the Burgundian War. In the 14th century the Dominican friar Ulrich Boner of Bern versified many old fables. More important of the historical chronicles. In the 14th century we have Christian Kuchmaster's continuation of the annals of the famous monastery of St. Gall. In the early 15th century the rhymed chronicle of the war between the Appenzellers and the abbot of St. Gall, and rather later in the same century the chronicles of Conrad, Justinger of Bern and Hans Freund of Lucerne. Besides the fantastical chronicle of Stratalegend and a scarcely less fanciful poem on the supposed Scandinavian descent of the men of Schwyz and of Oberhassel, both by Elogius Kiburger of Bern. In the 15th century, too, we have the White Book of Saunen and the first William Tell song, which gave rise to the well-known legend, as well as the rather later play named the Urnenspiel dealing with the same subject. The Burgundian War witnessed a great outburst of historical ardor in the shape of chronicles written by Diebold Schilling of Bern, by Melchior Rust Diebold Schilling the Younger and Peter Minetterlin, all three of Lucerne, as well as by Gerald Edlerbach of Zurich, and by John Ains Lenz of Brugg. In the vernacular, too, are the earliest descriptions of the Confederation, those by Albert von Bonstetten of Einsiedeln and by Conrad Turst of Zurich, to whom also we owe the first map of the country. The Swiss humanists wrote in Latin, as did also the Swiss reformers, at any rate for the most part, though the Zurich Bible of 1531 is an exception. Nicolas Manuel, a many-sided Bernese, composed satirical poems in German against the Pope, while Valerius Anselm, also of Bern, wrote one of the best Swiss chronicles. Egidius Tschudi of Glarus, despite great literary activity, published but a single German work in his lifetime. The Uraltorhafligalpischrische Sampete dem Tract der anderen Alpgebirgen. Besides his map of Switzerland, Sebastian Münster, who was a Swiss by adoption, published his Cosmographia in German, the work being translated into Latin in 1550. But the many-sided Conrad Gesner, a born Swiss, wrote all his works in Latin, German translations appearing only at the later date. The first important original product in German was the remarkable and elaborate History and Description of Switzerland, issued in 1548 at Zurich by Johannes Stumpf of that town. But Josias Simler, who was in a way his continuator, wrote all his works, theological and geographical, in Latin. Matthew Marion engraved many plates, which were issued in a series of volumes under the general title of Topographia, the earliest volume describing Switzerland, while all had a text in German by an Austrian, Martin Zierler. Very characteristic of the age are the autobiography of the valley scholar Thomas Platter and the diary of his still more distinguished son Felix, both written in German, though not published till long after. Gradually Swiss historical writers gave up the use of Latin for the native tongue. Sir Michael Stettler of Bern, Franz Hafner of Saulieu, and quite a number of Grisons authors, such as Bartholomew Sanhorn and his son of the same name and Johannes Güler von Winne. Fortunate's preacher preferred to write his Pallas Raratica in Latin, as did Fortunate von Uvalter in the case of his autobiography, the autobiography of Hans Adser of Davos, and the amusing dialogue between the Niesen and the Stockhorn by Hans Rudolf Friedmann are both in German. Jean-Baptiste Plantin wrote his description of Switzerland in Latin, Helvetia Novae Antiqua, but Johann Jacob Wagner's Guide to Switzerland is in German, despite its titles in De Memorabilium Helvetiae Mercurius Helveticus, though he issued his scientific description of his native land in Latin, Historia Naturalis Helvetiae Curiosa. 18th century. In the 18th century the intellectual movement in Switzerland greatly developed, though it was naturally strongly influenced by local characteristics. Basel, Bern and especially Zurich were the chief literary centers. Basel was particularly distinguished for its mathematicians, such as Leonhard Euler, and three members of the Bernoulli family, refugees from Antwerp, the brothers Jacob and Johann, and the latter's son Daniel. But its chief literary glory was Isaac Iserlohn, one of the founders of the Helvetic Society and of the Economical Society, and author of a treatise on the philosophy of history entitled Geschichte der Menschheit, and of another on ideal politics, Philosophische Unpatriotisch Trume eines Menschenfreunds, while many of his economical tracts appeared under the general title of Ephemeriden der Menschheit. At Bern, Albrecht von Haller, though especially distinguished as a scientific writer, yet by his poem Die Alpen and his travels in his native country did much to excite and stimulate the love of mountain scenery. Another Bernese, Charles Victor de Bonstetten, is a type of the Gallicized liberal Bernese patrician, while Ludwig von Muralt analyzed the racial characteristics of other nations for the instruction of his fellow countrymen. His Lettres sur les Anglais et les Français being his principal work. Samuel Wittenbach devoted himself to making known the beauties of his country to its natives, traveling much and writing much about his travels. Gottlieb Sigmund Gruner wrote the Eisgebirge des Schweizelands, a work describing the ice-clad mountains of Switzerland, though it is rather a Euseftal compilation than an original contribution to knowledge, but a decided advance on his fellow Bernese. Johann Georg Altmann's Versuch einer historischen und physischen Beschreibung die Helvetischen Eisgebirge, in another department of knowledge a son of Albrecht von Haller, Gottlieb Emanuel von Haller, compiled a most useful bibliography of writings relating to Swiss history, the Bibliothek die Schweizer Geschichte, that is still indispensable to the historical student. But in the 18th century Zurich was undoubtedly the intellectual and literary capital of German-speaking Switzerland, and gained the title of Athens on the limit. One of its earliest and most famous celebrities was J.J. Scherzer, who travelled much in Switzerland, and wrote much as to its natural curiosities, being himself an FRS, and closely associated with Newton and the other English scientific men of the day. But in the purely literary domain, the names of J.J. Bodmer and of his friend Johann Jacob Breitinger are the most prominent. By their united exertions, the antiquated traditions of German literature were broken down to a large extent, while great praise was bestowed on English poets, Shakespeare, Milton and others. The views were violently opposed by Goethe, the leader of the Saxon school, and the controversy that arose forms part of the history of German literature. In 1721 to 1723 they published jointly the Discours der Meter, a periodical which spread the views, while more elaborate and systematic expositions of the critical doctrine as to poetry are Bodmer's Kritische Behandlung von dem Wunderbaren in der Poesie, and Breitinger's Kritische Dichtkunst. Their untiring efforts helped to prepare the way for the later outburst of German literature begun by Klopstock, Wieland and Lessing. Another famous Zurich writer was Solomon Gesner, the pastoral poet, and yet another was J.K. Lavater, now best remembered as a supporter of the view that the face presents a perfect indication of character and that physiognomy may therefore he treated as a science. Other well-known Zurich names are those of J.H. Pestalozzi, the educationalist, of Johann Caspar Herzl, another of the founders of the Helvetic Society, and author of Die Wissenschafteins Philosophischen Bauers, and of Johann Georg Sulzer, whose chief work is one on the laws of art or aesthetics, entitled Allgemeine Theorie der Schön und Kunst. Outside the 3 towns named above there were several writers of German-speaking Switzerland who must be mentioned. One of the best known even now is Johann Georg Zimmermann, whose Betrachtungen über die Einsamkeit profoundly impressed his contemporaries. He, like the fabulous De Ehrlich, was born at Brugg. Johannes von Müller of Schaffhausen was the first who attempted to write a detailed history of Switzerland, which, though inspired rather by his love of freedom than by any deep research, was very characteristic of his times. J.G. Ebel was a Swiss by adoption only, but deserves mention as the author of the first detailed guidebook to the country, which held its ground till the days of Murray and Baedeker. A later writer, Heinrich Z. Schocker, also a Swiss by adoption only, produced a history of Switzerland written for the people, which had a great vogue. 19th century. In the later literary history of German-speaking Switzerland, 3 names stand out above all others. Albert Bitzius, known as Jeremiah Scott Elf, from the first of his numerous tales of peasant life in the Emmental. Gottfried Keller, perhaps the most genuinely Swiss poet and novelist of the century, and Conrad Ferdinand Meyer, also a poet and novelist, but of more cosmopolitan leanings and tastes. Jacob Burkhardt was a famous writer on Italian art, while Jacob Frey continued the work of Bitzius by his tales of Swiss peasant life. Ulrich Hegner of Winterthur wrote novels full of local color, as is also the case with David Hess in his description of a cure at Baden in Aargau and various tales. Johann Martin Usteri of Zurich was one of the earliest to write poems in his native dialect. Later we have a number of Zurich poets versifiers, some of whose writings have become very well known. Such were Heinrich Luther, August Karodi and Leonhard Widmer. The author of Trotzdem Morgenrot der is now known as the Swiss Psalm of Slebt in Jedisch Weise Brust and Woberg sicher haben. To the Bernese poet Johann Rudolf Wyss, whose father, Johann David Wyss, was the author of the Swiss Family Robinson, we owe the Swiss national anthem, Rust du mein Vaterland, and the song, Herz M. Alois Scherzer Aram Satrori, while Johann Georg Trauer of Lucerne wrote the Rutlerlied von Furnessii Herzlich gegrüßet, and Gottfried Keller himself was responsible for O mein Heimatland. Gottlieb Jacob Kuhn wrote many poems in the Bernese dialect about the Alps and their inhabitants, less national in sentiment and more metaphysical of the lyrics of Drantmore, the pen name of the Bernese Ferdinand Schmid. Among the chief Swiss writers in the department of belles lettres, novellists, poets, etc., may be mentioned Ernst Zahn, Meinrad Lienert, Arnold Ott, Karl Spittler, Fritz Marti, Walther Siegfried, Adolf Frey, Hermann Hesse, Jacob Christoph Hier, Joseph Victor Widmann, and Gottfried Strasser. Isabella Kaiser wrote poems and stories. Johanna Spyri is famous for her children's stories, including Heidi, a fictional character living in the Swiss Alps. 20th century, the Nobel Prize for Literature was awarded to Karl Spittler and Hermann Hesse. Robert Walser was only decades after his death in 1956 recognized as one of the great modern Swiss novelists at the beginning of the 20th century. Likewise, the revival of the works of travel writer and novelist Anne-Marie Schwarzenbach had to wait almost 50 years after her premature death in 1942. Friedrich Dürrenmatt was a playwright, author of philosophical crime novels and novellas. Max Frisch was also a playwright, but was famous for being considered the greatest Swiss novelist since Walser. Adolf Muschie is an important essayist. Peter Beichsel and Nuars Widmer write stories. Others worth mentioning are Melinda Nadj Abenji, Sibylle Berg, Erika Burkhardt, Jörg Fadespiel, Lucas Hartmann, Thomas Hurlimann, Franz Hohler, Zoe Jenny, Jörg Laederich, Hugo Loecher, Niklaus Meyenberg, Gerhard Meyer, Milena Moser, Adolf Muschie, Paul Nazon, Erika Pedretti, Martin Suter, Peter Weber, and Marcus Werner. Writers after 1990 are Peter Stamm, Lucas Barthus and Christian Krack. Historians. Important Swiss historians include Hildfins von Ochs, the historian of St. Gall, of which he had been a monk; J.C. Zellweger, the historian of Appenzell; J.J. Hottinget, the continuator of J. von Muller's Swiss history; Johann Ludwig Wursemberger, who all four wrote on Bernese history; A. von Tillier, J. E. Kopp, who rewrote early Swiss history on the basis of authentic documents; J. A. Pupikofer, History of the Thurgau; A. F. Stettler, Swiss Constitutional Matters; Johann Caspar Bluntschli, Swiss Constitutional Matters; E. von Wattenwalt and P.C. von Planter, History of the Grisons; Georg von Wist, to whom we owe, among many excellent works, an admirable account of all Swiss historians and the works. His step-brother F. von Wist, a great authority on the legal and constitutional history of Switzerland, and A.P. von Segesser, the historian and statesman of Lucerne; Jacob Burkhardt, Italian Renaissance; J.J. Blumert and E. Blush, the historian of the Protestant churches in German-speaking Switzerland; Johannes Dierauer, who read the impressive Geschichte der Schweizerischen Eidgenossenschaft, Tuvo 1887–91; R. Marc, who began the publication of the invaluable Flabsburg Terrier of the early 14th century, but had to leave the completion of the work to other competent hands; Felix Stahlen, Switzerland in the Roman era; also A. Ball, J. L. Brandstetter, W. Burkhardt, K. Dandliker, Ard Ura, H. Escher, A. Husler, R. Hoppler, T. von Liebenau, W. Merz, G. Meyer von Nonau, W. F. von Munen, W. O. Exley, J. R. Rahn, L. R. von Salis, P. Schweizer, J. Schollenberger, J. Strickler, R. Thomin, and H. Wortmann.